Good morning. It's day 4 of our Lent readings for 2022, and we're going to continue today in Mark, which we began yesterday. Now, Mark's Gospel, as I said, is short. It's only 16 chapters, but it's divided into 2 halves, and the turning point is in around chapter 8. And there are 2 questions being asked by Mark as he constructs his Gospel. The first is, in the first half, who is Jesus? And we saw that a bit yesterday when we saw the question the disciples asked at the end of the stilling of the storm. Who is he that even the wind and waves obey him? Then there's a turning point which we're going to look at in a moment in chapter 8, and goes on to the next part is, what did Jesus come to do? That first part, who is Jesus? It also contains something which is often called by theologians as the messianic secret. And you'll be familiar with this because you'll probably have noticed that Jesus often, particularly in Mark's Gospel, when he healed somebody, he said to them, be quiet and don't tell anyone what I've done. Or if he cast a demon out, he'd tell the demon, be quiet, do not speak, because the demons would often identify him. And you might think, well, why did Jesus want to silence people and not let people know who he was? That's because there was the general view of what the Messiah would be like. Within the society, Jews were always looking for the Messiah, someone who in their view would be in the mould of King David, someone who would come and deliver them and lead them in triumph and restore the land to them. They were under Roman occupation. It would be someone who would drive the Romans out in their mind. But Jesus was not that sort of Messiah, if I could use that phrase. Jesus, if it became known too quickly that he might be the Messiah, then the crowds got around him and tried to make him king by force, and then Rome would have crushed them and many would have died. But the revolution Jesus was bringing only needed one person to die. And through that, he wouldn't just free Israel from Rome, he'd free humanity from sin. Now, I want to look at the passage where that turning point takes place, and we can see both aspects of this, of who is Jesus and what he came to do. And we'll find it in Mark chapter 8, and we're going to start reading from verse 22. It starts with a parable, a healing, which will also be familiar. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spat on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, don't even go into the village. Jesus and his disciples went to the villages around Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked them, who do people say I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked, who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. This is the turning point in the Gospels. And it starts with a blind man who's healed. And there's various questions in that story, but one that you probably notice very much so is that Jesus appears to take 2 attempts. Why did Jesus take 2 attempts to heal this man? Why was it because the man didn't have enough faith? Was it because Jesus didn't always have the authority? Well, neither of those could be true, surely. So if Jesus took 2 attempts to heal a man, why? What was the meaning? And we see that meaning explained as we go on to look at the next story. Jesus is walking around Caesarea Philippi and he asks the question, which Mark's Gospel has been asking for the first half: who do people say I am? And they come out with various answers, and then Jesus makes it personal. But who do you say I am? And Peter makes that great declaration: you are the Messiah. Jesus still at that point says, you're right, but don't tell anyone. And then he goes on to talk about what will happen, about his death and resurrection. And that's that turning point from going from who is Jesus to what did Jesus come to do. And Peter's reaction is immediately to rebuke Jesus and takes him aside and says, you can't say these sort of things, Lord. Because to Peter, as to all Jews then, the Messiah, the idea of a dead Messiah, I mean, what's usually the dead Messiah? The Messiah's come to lead us into victory. A dead Messiah, that's an oxymoron. You know, those things, those contradictory phrases like plastic glasses, working holiday, fun run, rap music, dead Messiah. And Jesus then turns and rebukes Peter. You see, Peter is like the blind man. Spiritually speaking, he couldn't see who Jesus was. And then he suddenly sees Jesus is the Messiah. But it sees, as the blind man saw people walking around like trees, he doesn't see clearly. He sees half the story. As the blind man saw half the story then, Peter sees who Jesus is, but he still doesn't understand what he's come to do. And that's what the rest of the Mark's Gospel explains. What did Jesus come to do? I hope you've seen Jesus clearly. But maybe you feel a bit like the blind man. You hear about Jesus, you know of him. You don't really get what it's all about. Or maybe you see partly, you see that Jesus is clearly a holy man, a great teacher, and it's something really significant, but you don't really understand what his death and resurrection, why what that means for you. Well, my prayer is that by the power and grace of God, you'll come to see clearly not just who Jesus is, but what he came to do. And that you'll see his death and resurrection was for your sin as well as mine. Until next time, have a blessed day.